Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, sending so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing marvellously well and that you've had the most fabulous day. And before we get started, don't forget to get that fabulous hot cup of cocoa, fill it with lots of marshmallows and spoil yourself because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Baron, and I was born and raised in New York City, which comprises 5 boroughs, where the Hudson River meets the Atlantic Ocean. New York is long revered for its imposing bodacious skyscrapers, much like the Empire State Building and sprawling Central. When I was about 30 years old, I moved into the fetching Park Slopes neighbourhood with my young wife Kirsten. I gather it acquired its original name from the upward sloping streets towards Prospect Park. It would seem that before the 19th century, it's hard to believe that Park Slope was initially just farms and woodland areas, until the land was divided into rectangular parcels. In the 1880s, after the development of Prospect Park, copious amounts of mansions and row houses were erected in the eastern section, which is why this area possesses that quintessential historic intrigue that was so captivating to my wife and I when we first moved here after we initially got married, as we had a huge appreciation for the character and charm of old-world architecture that, in my opinion, eclipses anything much more modern. Funny enough, I actually met my wife Kirsten on the Brooklyn subway of all things. I'd seen her standing there on that long platform on multiple occasions, and I so longed to interact with her in some way, but I had about as much courage as a puny little mouse approaching a ravenous domestic cat. There was something about this girl's enchanting energy and the way that she laughed that was so beguiling for me. I was drawn to her like a moth being attracted and enticed by a dazzling bright light. At the very best of times, I was so reticent, painfully shy, and self-effacing. I always envied and admired other dudes who would always seem to be able to chat up women with a seamless ease, but that was never ever my experience. I did not have the gift of the gab, so to speak. If I liked someone I met, I'd be overwhelmed by a dreadful shyness. I always reacted to social interactions like a tortoise retreating into its shell. I'd find myself hopelessly tongue-tied or at a complete loss for words. I think most women completely lost interest in me because you could have cut the awkward silence with a knife. I imagine my lack of self-confidence must have been pretty unattractive to most women. Who could blame them for that? Because your first impression of someone is often the most lasting. Of course, it didn't help that growing up my siblings were all of the male gender, and that I had attended an all-boys school. So in truth, I didn't have any real experience with the opposite sex, and my greenness and naivety held me back considerably in my social prowess, so to speak, which, of course, was very inadequate. One day on the subway, I could bear it no longer as I saw my wife standing there. Of course, she wasn't my wife at the time. I just knew that I had to go up to her with all the courage that I could muster. And finally I approached her, using the lamest excuse in the book that you've ever heard. I said to her, "Your face is so familiar, I can't place you. Do I know you from somewhere?" "There's only one way to find out," she said. "Why don't you take me for a coffee?" I remember being completely floored, and I said, "Well, when would you like to go for coffee?" "Well, I'm free now," she said. "There's no time like the present." As you can imagine, the rest is history, as my wife and I fell in love, and I'd never met anyone like her before. She was humorous and funny, with an insatiable love for adventure that was so infectious, and an ardent passion for the great outdoors. Before long, Kirsten and I got married and moved into a very opulent, stylish Italianite red brick row house that had been built in the 1880s in Park Slopes, that was about 3 stories and was perfect for all our immediate needs. I'd always been a city slicker, and my wife and I enjoyed visiting quirky shops, especially the kind where you could find gifts for every single occasion. We also loved attending the farmers' market and tasting all the pickles on offer, or sampling the different local cheeses that were on display. We would often derive pleasure from taking long walks in Prospect Park and visiting some of the fabulous eateries on offer in Park Slopes, of which there were so many. I do remember a bagel place we would visit regularly where you could choose the most incredible delectable fillings for your bagels. My wife always ordered the cream cheese bagel with Oreo filling, while I preferred something much more savoury, usually with bacon in it. We had some wonderful, memorable and fun-filled times in Park Slopes. My wife began introducing me to camping holidays all around North America, and I even acquired a hunting licence. Before long, I became enamoured and transfixed by the natural world. It was almost as if I'd lived in a bubble all my life in the city, and like a butterfly I was emerging from a cocoon. I was suddenly seeing the world in a whole new, voracious, fresh and vibrant light. I was discovering so many extraordinary, marvellous things about the natural world that I'd been blindly oblivious of all my life. I hankered for the weekends to get out of New York and to spend a weekend with my beautiful, fun-loving wife on another one of our incredible wild adventures, of which there were so many. It was in 2006, when my wife and I had been married for over 9 years at the time, when we decided to go camping in an area of natural forest around the North Virginia area. I would rather keep the exact location private if you don't mind. Little did I know that this outdoor adventure would change my life dramatically in ways we could never even begin to envisage, and quite literally tear my life to shreds. It all began with a pretty standard camping trip that we'd planned over a spontaneous 3-day period, when we would normally have been working in our mediocre, rather mundane pedestrian jobs in the city. I'd heard about this idyllic wooded retreat from a friend of mine who'd informed me about how exquisite this location had been for him and his wife. "The mountainous terrain is very tricky," he warned me. "There are lots of sheer drops and mountainous ridges, which is why it's not popular with many hikers, because it can be very precarious. But when you camp on that high elevation and overlook the incredulous panoramic views, you'll be in heaven." Kirsten and I did not need any further encouragement, and we were not disappointed. Before long, I was driving my Jeep down a very rocky path, where my vehicle wobbled precariously down some of those bumpy dirt remote roads that were well off the beaten track. I discerned that there had been rain recently, as there were small pools of water within the uneven crevices of the road, causing dirty water to splash against the vehicle. Yet the recent rainfall in the area had transformed this ravishing green wilderness into an even more breathtaking verdant wonderland, and Kirsten and I were excited about this trip, and we didn't care if the ground was a wee bit damp. That wasn't going to bother us at all. We parked our Jeep in an overgrown parking bay that looked like it had not been tended to in over a decade, and armed with heavily laden backpacks, we steadily ascended uphill for several hours on an arduous, precipitous incline, which was not for the faint-hearted nor for those who suffered from vertigo, because when you looked down, you might have felt like you'd faint. We were sweating profusely and breathing heavily, despite the fact that we were both incredibly fit at the time. Before long, we discovered the quintessential camping spot, situated in the heart of the woods, that consisted of Douglas firs, European yews, hemlocks, cedars, red oaks, and celery-top pines. We found a smooth clearing large enough to put up our medium-sized tent, several yards away from the craggy rocky ridge. If you stood on the edge of this sheer drop, you would look down and marvel at the most panoramic views over the exquisite silvery lake that was fringed by the vast pyramid shapes of the mountains that rose up in the blue firmament like gargantuan, imposing, masterful giants. I noted that the idyllic, exquisite lake was flanked by a long line of Douglas firs, and these statuesque, imposing trees, along with the white fluffy clouds in the blue sky, were reflected in the shimmery watery expanse like a dreamy mirror. This whimsical, enchanting wood green that was surrounding us was also so magical and ethereal, very dreamy, a resplendent, rich oasis of greens bathed in a twinkling, subtle light that danced through the canopy and graced the floor in a soft, dappled luminescence that was both bedazzling and beguiling. It would seem that everything, including the rocky boulders and the trunks of the trees, were swathed in velvety green moss, and the forest floor was enveloped in the delicate beauty of lacy ferns and evergreen foliage. It was safe to say that Kirsten and I were completely transfixed by this verdant wonderland. "It's so beautiful here," said Kirsten, looking over the edge of the ridge to observe the views. "I don't believe we've ever camped anywhere quite as magnificent as this," she reflected. "It's exquisite," I admitted, taking my wife into my arms and kissing her on the cheeks affectionately. "And it seems we have this wonderful place all to ourselves. It couldn't be better." "I love it here," laughed Kirsten. "We're on top of the world. We can see for miles around us." "It's treacherous here, though," I warned. "Some of the moss is very slippery, especially after the recent rain, and we are on a high mountainous ridge, so you must watch your step, because you could easily slip." "You worry too much," said my wife, giving me a gentle squeeze. "Life without risks would be very mundane indeed." We set up our camp at lunchtime, and after a bite to eat, we decided to go for another quick hike through the wood green further up the mountain, as we had suddenly regained our strength. We began to trek uphill through the sylvan, and my wife stopped me suddenly in my tracks. "Shh!" she whispered. "Listen." "What? I don't hear anything at all," I said. "That's my point," said my wife. "Everything's gone so quiet. The bird song has just dissipated. Don't you think that's strange?" "I suppose it is odd," I said, but I gave the matter no further thought, and we proceeded along our way. We continued to walk for a little while longer, and then I got the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. It was a creepy sensation that caused the hair on the back of my neck to stand on edge, and I felt as if something was distinctly off. I was just about to express my misgivings to Kirsten when I discerned a very pungent odour on the wind that was really rather unpleasant and reminded me of cheesy trainers and stale urine. Suddenly I beheld a couple of young saplings swaying backwards and forwards, and I could see an obscure gargantuan black shadowy form moving between the trees, and I knew at once that we were in the presence of a predator. In that second my hackles rose, and my first thought that it was a bear. Then the critter surreptitiously moved a small curtain of the shrubbery with his big hand to get a better view of us. And that was when I observed the face that was 8 feet off the ground. I nearly fainted and passed out when I realised the critter was no bear. No, it had a humanoid ape-like face and very deep-set dark eyes, and it was staring at me with curious intrigue. I realised my wife had seen it too. The critter didn't growl or react in a negative way towards us, but that in no way suppressed my terror, for this daunting critter was the most threatening and intimidating beast that I'd ever seen. It really felt as if I was only yards away from something that could tear us apart, limb from limb, in a single second. I didn't know what the critter's intentions were with us, but I was certain they could not be good. It was all I could do to suppress the urgent desire to run. But running from a predator like this is incredibly unwise, and shooting at him would possibly ensure that we would never leave this place in one piece. Well, that is what I discerned anyway. "It's a Bigfoot," whispered my wife excitedly. "It's a Bigfoot!" I immediately manoeuvred my wife away from the area as I was overwhelmed with the most horrifying feeling of impending dread, and I was almost certain that we were both in terrible danger and that this critter could be trailing us. "Move," I said, pushing my wife forwards. "Move, quickly." "But I want to see the Bigfoot," she protested, resisting my attempts to move her away from the critter. "Move," I commanded her. When we got back to our camping spot, I told my wife that we should get out of there as fast as we possibly could. I did not feel comfortable about us staying with that Bigfoot loitering around, but my wife had other ideas and assured me that if the Bigfoot was a threat, it would have followed us already and shown aggression towards us, which it had not. In her opinion, it was reticent and curious. "I still think we should leave," I told her. "Why are you reacting like this?" said my wife, becoming incredibly upset and indignant. "The Bigfoot was innoxious and benign. It was possibly more frightened of us than we were of him. I think you're overreacting and being exceedingly unreasonable." "Did you see the size of that thing?" I protested. "He could have seriously harmed us." "Yes, but he didn't, did he?" "You really spoilt things for me back there," said Kirsten. "I desired to get a good look at him. I've always longed to see a Bigfoot, and now I'll never get the chance again." "Careful what you wish for," I said to her. It was with great regret that I allowed my wife to persuade me to stay at our camping site on the high rocky ridge, which in itself was more than a little precarious at the very best of times. Now, with that critter lurking around, or Bigfoot if you like, I didn't feel very safe. I gingerly decided that I'd keep a tight, prudent vigil all night to ensure that my wife and I were indeed both secure, and I sat up with my armed rifle safely by my side. I do not know why I had agreed to stay. The evening had been much more than a little stressful, as my wife was so irked with me for not letting her observe that Bigfoot. Yet aside from that minor discrepancy and our differing opinions on the Bigfoot, we still managed to have a great deal of fun, stargazing by the fire pit and enjoying a delicious steak dinner, as even the most simple things in life taste infinitely more delicious outdoors. I sat up for a long while in my tent, feeling lethargic and incredibly drowsy, while I could hear the gentle snores coming from my wife, who was now sound asleep. All of a sudden, the urge overtook me to just close my heavy eyelids just for a moment, and I must have dozed off because I surrendered to a very deep state of sleep. I remember waking up the following morning with the light streaming through my tent. "Damn," I thought to myself, "I didn't intend to go to sleep. How could I have allowed that to happen?" I looked at the time, and it was already 9:30. I was astonished. I never normally slept in this late, but the challenging hike had clearly exhausted me. I realised that Kirsten must already be up, but I grew increasingly frantic when I called for her and couldn't find her anywhere. "Kirsten! Kirsten! Kirsten!" I called, but no answer came to me. I remember feeling sick to my stomach, like I wanted to violently throw up, because I was certain something quite dreadful had happened to her. The first thought that came to my mind was that she had been abducted by a Bigfoot. I examined the edges of our campsite, and on the soft ground several yards away from our tent, within the tree line, was something very distinctive, a fresh footprint in the mud, and it was very big. It could only have been made by a Bigfoot. And it was fresh. It must have been made during the night. Now I was beside myself with great anxiety, as I was beginning to imagine all kinds of worst-case scenarios of what could have become of my wife. All of a sudden I heard a helicopter flying overhead and distant voices, and then I looked downwards from the sheer rocky ridge and observed the most horrifying sight that to this very day sends chills down my spine. I discerned the deceased body of my wife. I knew she was deceased because that she was just a bedraggled heap that was being lifted into a helicopter and being flown away. I recognized the clothes immediately as I watched her body being placed into a body bag and loaded into a helicopter, and I was powerless to do a thing. As the helicopter flew away, I began to scream and scream and scream. I was to find out later that a couple of early morning hikers on the lower elevations of the rugged mountainous trail had decided to take a brisk early morning walk and had spotted my wife's crumpled body lying below the rocky ridge, as she had fallen from a great height. I gather they frantically called out for help, and within 10 minutes the flying helicopter's medical team had arrived to escort her away to the nearest hospital. It was sadly too late, as my wife was beyond saving. And all this buzzing activity had ensued with me being blindly oblivious, which was more than a little disconcerting and left me feeling really rather helpless. It would seem that the medical examiner hypothesized that my wife had slipped and fallen during the night over the rocky ridge to her death, as visibility would have been poor with so little moonlight. It would seem that she was found with a shattered flashlight still in her hands. I was assured by the medical examiner that no foul play was involved, and even when I suggested that my wife could have been pushed, The examiner thought such a suggestion was highly unlikely. "Look, Mr. Green, I'm not going to beat around the bush," he informed me. "I'm going to tell you as it is. Your wife had a terrible, unfortunate accident. It would seem that you were camped up on a high ridge, and that's always a big risk. There was also recently a great deal of rain in the area. I imagine she got up during the night to answer a call of nature. The light was very bad, and she slipped, lost her footing, and fell over the sheer rocky ridge. It's difficult to see where you're going in the dark. It can happen to the best of us. I assure you, in my practice, I see these kind of accidents all the time, and I do deem that your wife's accident was not suspicious. I even got my investigations to examine the site, and they assured me that the area was very slippery. They saw the skid marks, and it would have been easy to happen to anyone. It was a very sheer drop, and it's not for the first time that people have fallen from their death there. It's a very difficult spot, and I had a similar death like that last year." I'm afraid I couldn't agree with the findings of the medical examiner. I was certain that my wife was chased by a Bigfoot and fell to her death, or was calculatingly pushed over the ridge by the evil critter. I missed my wife so incredibly much. Her laughter, her bright, beautiful, cheerful smile, her huge sense of adventure. I blamed Bigfoot for her death and held him entirely responsible. The anger and hatred I felt towards him was off the charts, and like anything else I've ever experienced. A couple of years went by, and my aching grief and hopeless emptiness and despair was compounded by this dolorous sense of loss, as my wife's absence in my life left me feeling completely hollow. My former, once very happy and full earthly existence had become void of any meaning and purpose. I also felt riddled with guilt, regret, and self-condemnation. I wished with all my heart that I could turn back the pages of time and change the sequence of events as they had occurred. I would never have camped out on such a sheer drop, nor would we have remained in that location after encountering the treacherous Bigfoot. And last but not least, I should never have fallen asleep. And so began my resolute quest to eliminate the Bigfoot that we had encountered and remove him off the face of the earth, never to draw breath again or wake up to embrace another day. For Bigfoot was the cause of my wife's life coming to an untimely end, and I was determined to seek my revenge, and nothing was ever going to stop me, for indeed my mission was very, very urgent. So armed with high-caliber rifles, I frequented the area over and over again in my tireless search for Bigfoot. It would seem that much like so many of those programs you watch on television, searching for Bigfoot, I would feel like I kept drawing blanks over and over again, never with any results. I even wondered if Bigfoot had some kind of extrasensory perception and could in fact perceive when people were trying to locate him or hunt him down. Nothing would have surprised me in regards to these duplicitous, insidious and hideously evil creatures as far as I was concerned. Granted, I did come across a large footprint in the mud, and I even stumbled across an old Bigfoot nest. Yet Bigfoot I did not find, but I was still relentless upon my obsessive goal to seek out the Bigfoot and kill him, if I ever got the chance, and the sooner I achieved my mission, the better. Then one day on my hiking excursion, as odd as this may sound, I had a heightened sense that this day was going to be incredibly different. The only way that I can describe it was like a premonition or a sense of knowing. But one thing I did not perceive was that things would not pan out quite in the way that I expected them to. As I was walking through the Sylvan, the bird song filled my ears with the prettiest warbles and chirps, and I observed squirrels darting up trees and one or two chipmunks crossing my path. All of a sudden, the music of the woods just switched off like a plug being pulled out of the radio. Everything went incredibly quiet, and airily so. It was like the feeling that I'd experienced once in the wood with Kirsten when we had encountered the critter for the first time. Now I was very certain that Bigfoot was around, and my eyes surveyed the Sylvan with a speedy determination, much like an eagle scanning the terrain for a rabbit or a vole. Suddenly, running through the thicket towards me was a 2-foot Bigfoot, and I was unprepared for such a unique encounter, as this critter was anything but menacing, and it was so incredibly young. It stood yards away from me, scratching its head curiously, regarding me through mischievous, humorous dark eyes. It then threw a pine cone at me cheekily, and went and hid behind a tree, and was peering at me, as it peeked at me behind the large tree trunk. It was as if it was saying, "Try and catch me." I knew that this naughty thing was playing with me, and I don't know why, but I responded by throwing back a pine cone at it, and then began this curious game of hiding and throwing pine cones at each other. I began to laugh like I've never laughed before, and we played together for quite some time, and it was the first time in a long time that my face has ever cracked a smile. I stopped dead in my tracks. This was ridiculous. I was here trying to kill a Bigfoot, but this critter was only 2 foot tall and had the loveliest congenial nature. How could I possibly kill it? Suddenly I heard the sound of what I can only describe as very heavy feet thundering towards us, and that was when I saw her. It was a large female Bigfoot, and the expression on her face was very earnest and afraid, as her wide, frightened eyes regarded my rifle with grave concern, and then she studied me. It was like she was reading my very intentions and thoughts and looking right through me, wondering whether I intended to harm her and her little one, and what course of action she should actually take. I realized she knew exactly what my rifle was for, and it seemed like she didn't trust me entirely, for she seized her child in her arms very anxiously and ran backwards in the brush, all the while her steely eyes pinned on me and my rifle. If anything, she was more afraid of me than I was of her, and I'd only seen her because she'd come to the rescue of her youngling, who did not know any better than to play with me. I imagine in his innocent juvenile and inexperienced eyes, I possibly looked like a small hairless Bigfoot to a degree, and at that age the mischievous critter was just looking to play with someone. It would seem we were not really that different. Suddenly I felt incredibly ashamed as I studied my rifle, knowing what my cruel intentions had actually been that day. And it would seem that the 2 Bigfoots I had encountered had been anything but aggressive, and I'm quite sure that I would never have encountered them if it had not been for the bold confidence of the little one. Looking back, the female Bigfoot must have been about 7 foot tall. She was probably about 600 pounds or more, and 3 foot wide, with a V-shaped torso and pert, very small breasts that were covered with hair. I noticed that her legs appeared short and very slim, but that could have been because her overlong arms were so long that could have made her legs appear short, if you understand what I'm saying. I discerned she was exceptionally lean, with dense, sinewy muscles, and a cone-shaped head that seemingly was attached to the shoulders directly, as I observed that there was no neck to speak of. It was the human-like face of the critter that rebroadcast itself into my mind over and over again. I remember the feminine, gentle, beautiful grey face with its soft contours, the deep-set, worried dark eyes, the flat nose, the prominent wrinkled brow ridge, and the wide, thin lips. I can see every detail of her as clearly as if it was yesterday, and she was so wonderful in every way. How could I have thought so badly of these creatures? I do remember returning home, and for the very first time since Kirsten's death, I began to sob and sob and sob, and finally it was as if a weight had been lifted off my life, and I began to heal, and I healed fast. Fast forward another 2 years, and I finally found a new love in my life, a wonderful woman called Bree. And one of the greatest ironies of all was that she was passionate about Bigfoot. She loved the creature so much, and was so mortified when I told her how I had intended to kill as many of them as I could find to extract my revenge for my wife. "I do understand," she said. "Although it is possible Bigfoot did push your wife over the ridge or scared her half to death, and then she fell, I do think the medical examiner was actually right. It was all possibly just a tragic accident. It's easy to walk out there in the dark and get confused and trip over the rocky ledge. Or maybe she could have run forward and seen a Bigfoot and got so excited and in her excitement just slipped. You never know. All kinds of things could have happened. Imagine my surprise when one day I was having dinner in a local restaurant with Bree, and a woman came up to me and said, "I do apologise for troubling you. Do you mind if I speak to you? I'm a psychic medium." "Go ahead," I said. "Be my guest. I can't say I'm going to believe what you tell me. I'm not really into that kind of stuff, and I am deeply cynical." "Am I right in saying that your wife has crossed over to the other side?" she asked me. "That's right," I said. "Well, since I've come into the restaurant, your wife has been prodding me to come and speak to you urgently. She has a very important message for you. She tells me to tell you that it was an accident. Does that make any sense to you at all?" I nodded. "Yes, it does make sense, yes." "She tells me that it was very dark. She couldn't see at all, and the battery of her flashlight failed to work. She says she was fumbling around in the darkness like a blind man. Does that make any sense to you?" "Oh, yes, it does." "She said she wouldn't have changed anything for the world. She loves adventure. And she says stop blaming yourself for what happened, that it was her time to go. She says that she's there with your little girl." "But we didn't have any children," I said. "Well, she said that she was pregnant for about 2 months and miscarried." That's right. We did have a miscarriage." "Well, that's the baby that she's with now. She says she's very happy and she's at peace. She tells me to tell you that she loves you very much, and she approves of the two of you being together. She had something to do with you coming together." "Oh, I see. Now I must go. I'm afraid I can't have these dead people holding me up from my pizza. I hope I didn't interfere too much. No, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much indeed. You've made me feel very good about things." "There you are," said Bree. "It was an accident. I've been praying to God that you would find out the truth in some way, and that's a direct answer to my prayers." To cut a long story short, Bree and I are now very happily married, and we have 3 marvellous children, all of our own. We still live in the Park Slope neighbourhood, but in a different house, of course. Looking back, I think maybe my first wife may have heard a sound during the night that she hoped was a Bigfoot, or it may well have been that she just became very excited and didn't know where she was going and tripped and fell over. But I no longer believe that Bigfoot was responsible for her demise. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. And until next time, goodbye and good night.